The Soviet Air Defense Command briefing document from August 1981 describes the MiG-25 Foxbat as possessing decisive tactical advantages in high-altitude interception scenarios against strategic bomber formations. That's the sanitized translation. The original Russian uses prevoskodstvo, which means supremacy or dominance. They believed it. The MiG-25 was designed to kill the B-70 Valkyrie, Mach 3 interceptor built around two massive Tumansky R-15 engines that burned fuel so fast the aircraft needed ground crew in asbestos suits during engine runs. The B-70 program got canceled in 1961. The MiG-25 entered service anyway in 1970 because the Soviets figured the Americans would build something else that flew high and fast. They were half right. Viktor Belenko's defection to Japan in September 1976 gave American intelligence the first close look at what the Foxbat actually was. Welded steel airframe, vacuum tube electronics, a radar system, the RP-25 Smerch, that could track large targets at maybe 100 kilometers in ideal conditions. The Pentagon's assessment noted the aircraft was optimized for a threat environment that no longer exists. Polite way of saying the Soviets built a billion-dollar solution to a canceled airplane. Here's what the MiG-25 couldn't do well. Track small targets, fight in the clutter of low-altitude radar returns, engage multiple threats simultaneously, turn without ripping its wings off, fly more than 40 minutes without landing to refuel. Here's what it could do. Go very fast in a straight line at very high altitude. Soviet doctrine worked around these limitations. The MiG-25 wasn't supposed to dogfight. Ground control would vector it toward American bomber streams. The pilot would accelerate to interception speed. Fire R-40 missiles at the formation from maximum range. Disengage before fighter escorts could respond. Simple. Fast. Theoretically effective against B-52s flying predictable routes at 40,000 feet. The McDonnell Douglas F-15A Eagle entered operational service with the first tactical fighter wing at Langley Air Force Base in January 1976. Nobody told the Soviets it was coming. Obviously, they knew the Americans were building a new air superiority fighter. What they couldn't know until it was too late, was how good the radar was. The AN/APG-63 pulse Doppler radar could detect fighter-sized targets at ranges exceeding 160 kilometers. In look-down mode, through ground clutter, while tracking multiple targets simultaneously. The system was designed by Hughes aircraft engineers who'd spent the 1960s solving the exact problems that made the MiG-25's radar mediocre. Soviet intercept doctrine assumed their ground controllers would detect American aircraft first, vector the MiG-25 into firing position. The interceptor pilot would activate his radar only for terminal guidance. Total radar emission time, maybe 90 seconds. Too brief for American fighters to get a bearing and respond. That assumption died over the North Sea in late 1982 when F-15 pilots started tracking MiG-25s before the Soviet interceptors knew anyone was there. The specific incidents are buried in classified mission reports. Some of those reports got declassified in 2008. Most didn't. What leaked out through Norwegian intelligence sharing and one very specific defector interview suggests Soviet Air Defense Command realized they had a catastrophic problem. Their premier interceptor was visible to American fighters at ranges where Soviet pilots couldn't see anything but empty sky on their scopes. The panic started quietly. Viktor Bekrenev flew 47 intercept missions between 1979 and November 1982. His squadron, the 174th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment based at Monchegorsk, operated the MiG-25 PD variant with improved avionics and better R-40TD missiles. The PD stood for Perekhvatchik Dorabotany, which means improved interceptor. Improved compared to what came before. Still using the same basic radar. November 18, 1982. Bekrenev gets scrambled at 1340 hours. Ground control reports single hostile track heading northeast over the Norwegian Sea. Range 240 kilometers. Altitude estimated 35,000 feet. Speed subsonic. Classification: Probably reconnaissance aircraft. Vector to intercept. Standard procedure. Bekrenev's done this exact mission profile 20-something times. Climb to 40,000. Accelerate to Mach 1.8. Close to 80 kilometers. Activate RP-25 radar. Acquire target. Fire if hostile. Usually the Americans turn away when Soviet interceptors get close. The reconnaissance planes, RC-135s mostly, don't want trouble. They collect signals intelligence and go home. Bekrenev reaches intercept altitude at 1347. He's 180 kilometers from the reported contact. His radar is still in standby mode. Ground control updates the vector. Target bearing 047 degrees, range 160 kilometers, still closing. Then, his SPO-15 radar warning receiver lights up. Here's the tangent, and it matters. The SPO-15 Beryoza system was installed on MiG-25 PD aircraft starting in 1978. It detects radar emissions from other aircraft. Specifically, it tells the pilot when someone is actively tracking him with fire control radar. The system displays threat direction on a small scope in the cockpit and provides audio warnings through the pilot's headset. Different tones for different threat types. Search radar sounds like a slow beep. Fire control radar sounds like a continuous buzz. Bekrenev's SPO-15 goes from silent to continuous buzz in 1 second. Fire control radar, bearing 045 degrees, same direction as the reported hostile. But the range doesn't make sense. Ground control says the target is 160 kilometers away. The SPO-15 only detects fire control radars that are actively tracking you with enough power to matter. Most fighter radars don't have that kind of range. American F-4 Phantoms, the standard NATO fighter Bekrenev trained to fight, had radar detection ranges around 50 to 60 kilometers against fighter targets. This radar was tracking him from 160 kilometers. Bekrenev's debriefing, parts of which appeared in a 1994 Russian Aviation Journal article before someone decided it was too sensitive and pulled subsequent issues, states he immediately requested clarification from ground control. The transcript allegedly exists in military archives. I've never seen it. What the journal article quotes is Bekrenev asking, "What type of aircraft?" and ground control responding, "Unknown, maintain vector." His SPO-15 stayed locked the entire approach. Range counting down, 150 kilometers, 140 kilometers. His own radar still in standby because doctrine says don't emit until you're close enough to matter. At 120 kilometers, Bekrenev activates his RP-25. He's looking for the contact. His scope is cluttered with ground returns from the Norwegian coast. The RP-25 isn't great at distinguishing small targets from background noise at long range. He doesn't find anything. The SPO-15 is still screaming. Someone has fire control lock on him. He can't see them. Ground control keeps insisting the hostile is there bearing 045. At 100 kilometers, Bekrenev requests permission to disengage. Ground control denies. At 80 kilometers, he disengages anyway. Turns hard south. Descends. Breaks radar lock by putting terrain between himself and whoever was tracking him. The SPO-15 goes quiet at 95 kilometers during his turn. He never saw the other aircraft. Rick Parsons flew F-15A Eagles with the 493rd Tactical Fighter Squadron out of RAF Lakenheath, starting in October 1981. The 493rd was the first operational F-15 unit assigned to USAFE, and their primary mission was air superiority over the North Atlantic approaches. Soviet bombers and reconnaissance aircraft probing NATO airspace. Soviet fighters escorting them or running their own intercept missions against NATO aircraft, doing the same thing in reverse. The game worked like this. Soviet aircraft would fly toward the Gok Gap, Greenland, Iceland, UK, testing response times and mapping radar coverage. NATO fighters would intercept. Everyone would fly parallel courses for a while. Take photographs. Maybe some maneuvering if someone felt aggressive. Then the Soviets would turn around and go home. Repeat weekly. Parsons' first intercept mission happens November 2, 1982. He's flying combat air patrol with his wingman over the Norwegian Sea when AWACS calls out a contact. Single aircraft heading west, high altitude, fast. Profile matches MiG-25 Foxbat, standard intercept. Parsons turns toward the contact, and his AN/APG-63 radar picks up the target at 147 miles. The number stuck with him because he mentioned it specifically during a 1995 interview for an Air Force Historical Foundation oral history project. 147 miles. That's 237 kilometers. His wingman confirms the track 2 seconds later. The F-15's radar is genuinely remarkable, and I don't use that word much. Pulse Doppler system that can look down through ground clutter and separate moving targets from stationary returns. Track while scan mode lets it follow multiple targets simultaneously while still searching for new ones. The pilot can lock one target, and the radar keeps updating tracks on everything else it sees. Combat capability. The MiG-25's 1959 vintage system couldn't approach. Parsons locks the MiG-25 at 140 miles. His radar warning indicator shows active. The Soviet pilot knows someone is tracking him. Parsons closes to 100 miles. Still no visual. The Foxbat is too far away and probably above him. Then, the Soviet aircraft turns hard south and descends. AWACS confirms the maneuver. Soviet fighter is disengaging, breaking off the intercept run before getting anywhere near British airspace. Parsons thought maybe the pilot had mechanical problems. Fuel emergency. Something wrong with the aircraft. The maneuver was aggressive, almost panicked. Not the usual slow turn away that Soviet pilots used when they'd collected enough intelligence and decided to go home. 2 weeks later, same thing happens. Different MiG-25, same profile. High altitude approach from the northeast. Parsons gets vectored to intercept. Locks the contact at 152 miles. The Soviet fighter immediately turns away. Hard southbound turn. Descends. Gone. By December, it was happening regularly. Soviet interceptors would approach. F-15's would lock them at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The Soviet aircraft would disengage before closing to visual range. Sometimes the disengagement was orderly. Sometimes it looked like the pilot was running. Wing intelligence officers noticed the pattern, started asking questions. Were the Soviets testing F-15 radar capabilities? Running some kind of training exercise? Deliberately probing to see how NATO fighters would respond? Or were they genuinely surprised that American fighters could track them from distances their doctrine said was impossible? Parsons flew 14 intercept missions between November 1982 and February 1983. 11 involved Soviet aircraft turning away after radar lock. He got visual identification exactly twice. Both times the Soviet pilots were already disengaging when he closed to 20 miles. He never fired a shot, didn't need to. The radar was doing something the Soviets hadn't planned for. Their interceptors couldn't hide anymore. The AN/APG-63 radar was built by Hughes Aircraft Company between 1972 and 1975, specifically for the F-15 program. Pulse Doppler architecture operating in X-band frequency. The system generates pulses at specific intervals and measures the Doppler shift in return signals to distinguish moving targets from stationary background. That's how it defeats ground clutter. Stationary objects have zero Doppler shift. Moving aircraft create measurable frequency changes. The radar filters out everything that isn't moving. Maximum detection range against fighter-sized targets. Classified. Publicly available estimates say 160 kilometers in lookup mode. Less in look-down mode, but still exceeding 120 kilometers. The exact numbers depend on target radar cross-section and atmospheric conditions, and whether the target is maneuvering or flying straight. Track while scan lets the radar maintain up to 10 target tracks simultaneously while continuing to search for new contacts. The pilot sees multiple blips on his scope, each one labeled with range, altitude, closure rate. He can lock any target without losing track of the others. Combat capability that didn't exist in previous American fighters. The RP-25 Smerch radar installed in MiG-25P and MiG-25PD aircraft was designed by Phasotron in the late 1950s. Different philosophy entirely. High-powered continuous wave system optimized for detecting large targets at high altitude. big bomber formations, the kind of threat the Soviets expected to face during World War III. Detection range against bomber-sized targets, maybe 100 kilometers on a good day. Against fighter-sized targets, that number drops to 50 or 60 kilometers. The system has no pulse Doppler capability. It can't filter ground clutter effectively. Look-down performance is terrible. The pilot has to visually distinguish target returns from background noise on his scope. Easy against B-52s flying at 40,000 feet over empty ocean. Nearly impossible against single fighters at medium altitude over land. The RP-25 can only track one target at a time. Lock mode requires the pilot to manually center the target blip on his scope and maintain that lock while maneuvering. Lose the lock and he has to reacquire from scratch. Soviet doctrine worked around this limitation by using ground-controlled intercepts. The pilot doesn't need to find targets himself. Ground radar does that. He just needs to close the final 50 kilometers and fire missiles. That doctrine assumed Soviet ground radar would detect American aircraft first. The F-15's AN/A PG-63 broke that assumption. American fighters could detect and track Soviet interceptors before Soviet ground controllers finished the intercept geometry. The MiG-25 pilot would be flying toward what he thought was a reconnaissance aircraft 200 kilometers away. Meanwhile, an F-15 already had him locked from 150 kilometers and was maneuvering for advantage. Soviet pilots discovered this through their SPO-15 radar warning receivers. The SPO-15 tells you when someone is tracking you. It doesn't tell you what kind of aircraft. It doesn't tell you their exact range. Just that fire control radar is painting you from somewhere in a general direction. Imagine flying an intercept mission, and your warning receiver suddenly screams at you when the hostile is supposedly 160 kilometers away. Your own radar can't see anything at that range. Ground control insists the target is still distant, but someone has fire control lock on you right now. Do you keep closing? Or do you assume the Americans have something new and your commanders didn't tell you about it? Soviet MiG-25 pilots started choosing option 2. The aircraft that was built to dominate high-altitude intercepts became the aircraft that ran away when American fighters showed up. Soviet Air Defense Forces issued Tactical Guidance Document 447/82 on December 14, 1982. The document was classified secret and distributed to MiG-25 regiments operating along the northern approaches. I have never seen the actual directive. What I have seen is a reference to it in a 1991 Russian Defense Ministry analysis that got partially declassified in 2007, then immediately reclassified when someone realized it contained information about Cold War intercept doctrine that was still considered sensitive. The reference describes 447/82 as authorization for immediate tactical disengagement upon detection of long-range fire control radar emissions, consistent with AN/AP G63 characteristics. Translation: run when the F-15 locks you. The directive didn't use those words, obviously. Soviet military documents are bureaucratic and indirect. But the operational meaning was clear. If your SPO-15 radar warning receiver indicates fire control lock at ranges exceeding 100 kilometers, you are authorized to break off the intercept without requesting permission from ground control. Disengage, evade, return to base. That's a huge doctrinal shift. Soviet intercept procedures were rigidly controlled from the ground. Pilots followed vectors. Ground controllers managed the engagement geometry. Individual initiative was discouraged. You did what ground control told you to do. Deviating without authorization could get you grounded or worse. Directive 447/82 gave MiG-25 pilots permission to ignore ground control and run away. The authorization was limited to specific threat conditions, but the message was unmistakable. Soviet Air Defense Command recognized their interceptors were vulnerable to something they couldn't effectively counter. Norwegian intelligence collected fragments of this through signals, intercepts, and one incident that I can only partially verify. March 1983. 2 MiG-25s from Monchegorsk get scrambled to intercept NATO reconnaissance aircraft operating near the Barents Sea. F-15's from Lakenheath are flying combat air patrol in the area. The American fighters detect and lock both MiG-25s at ranges exceeding 130 kilometers. Both Soviet pilots immediately disengage, break south, descend to low altitude where ground clutter makes radar tracking difficult. Norwegian radar operators monitoring the engagement. Note the MiG-25s are maneuvering aggressively. Hard turns, rapid altitude changes. The kind of flying you do when you think someone is about to shoot at you. Nobody shot at them. The F-15s maintained their patrol pattern. The MiG-25s returned to base. The incident report apparently included radio intercepts of the ground controller, trying to order the MiG-25s back toward the intercept. The pilots refused. One supposedly transmitted something like, "Negative return to target. RWR indicates fire control lock, executing evasive maneuvers per directive." That quote feels too clean. Radio intercepts from distance rarely capture exact phrasing. But the pattern is documented. Soviet pilots citing directive authority to justify breaking off intercepts when their warning receivers lit up. Here's the detail that connects to nothing. One of the MiG-25s landed with stress cracks in the vertical stabilizer from high G maneuvering during the disengagement. Maintenance records note the damage required replacing the entire tail section. Cost something like 400,000 rubles. The pilot was not disciplined. That last part matters because damaging your aircraft through aggressive maneuvering without combat necessity usually gets you in trouble. But this pilot was following doctrine. The damage was considered acceptable loss. I found that detail in a 2003 memoir by a Soviet air defense maintenance officer who served at Monchegorsk during the 1980s. He mentions the incident in passing, one sentence. Never references it again. I spent 2 weeks trying to find corroborating sources. Found nothing. Maybe he made it up. Maybe he remembered wrong. Maybe it happened exactly as he wrote and nobody else documented it. Either way, the larger pattern holds. Soviet MiG-25 units were running from F-15s by spring 1983. Norwegian intelligence service radar stations along the northern coast tracked Soviet air activity throughout the Cold War. The installations at Vardo and Andoya had clear sightlines into Soviet airspace. They monitored takeoffs from Monchegorsk and Kilpyavor, tracked flight paths, logged intercept attempts. The data went to NATO intelligence fusion centers, where analysts looked for patterns. Between November 1982 and December 1983, Norwegian radar operators documented 47 separate incidents where Soviet MiG-25 interceptors broke off engagement before reaching visual range of NATO aircraft. 18 of those incidents involved what the logs describe as aggressive, evasive maneuvering inconsistent with standard disengagement procedures. The pattern was obvious. Soviet pilots were running. Some context helps. Prior to November 1982, Soviet intercept doctrine was predictable. MiG-25s would close to approximately 40 to 50 kilometers. Visual identification if possible. Parallel course for intelligence collection. Then orderly turn back toward base. The entire sequence was controlled from ground stations. Radio traffic between pilots and controllers followed standard procedures. Calm, professional, routine. After November 1982, the intercepts got chaotic. MiG-25s would approach, then suddenly turn away at ranges exceeding 100 kilometers. Hard turns, emergency descents. Radio traffic increased, ground controllers issuing repeated vectors that pilots ignored. The Norwegian operators couldn't understand the Russian transmissions, but the tone and frequency suggested confusion or argument. NATO intelligence analysts initially thought the Soviets were running some kind of exercise, testing new tactics, maybe training pilots for different threat scenarios. That assessment changed after Captain Mikhail Volkov defected to Norway in August 1983 with a briefcase full of maintenance logs from the 174th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment. Volkov was a MiG-25 pilot. He'd flown intercept missions over the North Sea and Barents Sea. He brought technical documents showing aircraft readiness rates, sortie logs, maintenance reports, and his personal notes describing what Soviet pilots were being told about American F-15s. The defection documents included references to multiple incidents where MiG-25 pilots refused intercept missions outright, claimed mechanical problems, filed reports citing equipment malfunctions that maintenance inspection couldn't verify. One pilot apparently told his squadron commander that continuing to fly intercepts against F-15A without effective countermeasures was suicide by policy. That quote appears in a CIA assessment from September 1983. The assessment was declassified in 2009 with heavy redactions. Most of the tactical analysis is blacked out. What remains readable describes Soviet air defense forces experiencing significant morale degradation among interceptor units tasked with NATO air defense missions. Volkov's debriefing transcripts were never fully released. Portions appeared in a 1995 book about Cold War defectors. He described the MiG-25 as obsolete against modern American fighters. Said Soviet pilots knew they were flying aircraft that couldn't compete. Ground controllers kept sending them toward F-15s anyway, because doctrine required maintaining intercept presence regardless of tactical effectiveness. The Norwegian radar logs show declining Soviet intercept activity through late 1983. Fewer scrambles, longer response times. Some NATO reconnaissance missions drew no Soviet response at all. The missions that did get intercepted often ended with MiG-25s turning away at extreme range. By early 1984, the intercept game had changed completely. Soviet fighters were still flying, still responding to NATO presence. But they weren't pressing encounters anymore. They'd watch from distance, stay outside F-15 engagement range, collect what intelligence they could without getting close enough to matter. The aircraft that was supposed to dominate Soviet air defense had become an observer platform, flying missions designed to avoid contact with the very targets it was built to kill. 18 documented panic disengagements. Pilots breaking doctrine to survive aircraft they couldn't see and couldn't fight. USAF intelligence officers at Lakenheath noticed the pattern shift in December 1982. Soviet intercept behavior had changed. The MiG-25 units were disengaging earlier, maneuvering more aggressively, refusing to close to visual range, even when NATO aircraft were flying predictable reconnaissance tracks. Captain Denis Kowalski was the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing intelligence officer from 1982 to 1984. His job involved analyzing Soviet air activity and briefing F-15 pilots on threat patterns. He compiled reports on intercept trends, documented the behavioral changes, sent assessments up the chain to USAFE headquarters. Those assessments noted that Soviet pilots appeared to be reacting to F-15 radar locks at ranges that shouldn't have been tactically significant. The typical engagement geometry involved the F-15 detecting and tracking the MiG-25 at 130 to 150 kilometers. The Soviet pilot would maintain course for maybe 30 seconds, then break off abruptly and run. Kowalski's December 1982 assessment, portions of which were declassified in 2011, described this as possible Soviet recognition of AN/AP G-63 long-range tracking capability resulting in revised intercept doctrine, emphasizing survival over mission completion. Translation: they know our radar is better and they're scared. The assessment went to USAFE intelligence. From there, it should have gone to the Defense Intelligence Agency, should have been analyzed alongside other theater reports, should have informed broader assessments of Soviet air defense capabilities and doctrine changes. It disappeared instead. I've looked for follow-up reports, systematic analysis of what the Soviet behavioral changes meant, assessments of whether this represented a fundamental shift in Warsaw Pact air defense strategy or just localized tactical adjustments by Northern Fleet units. Found nothing. The records from 1983 and 1984 that should contain this analysis are either still classified or were never written. FOIA requests for related documents. Get responses saying the files don't exist or can't be located or are exempt from release under national security provisions. Norwegian intelligence shared their radar tracking data with NATO. The data showing 47 incidents of Soviet disengagement and 18 panic maneuvers. That information was briefed to Alliance intelligence committees. Someone wrote reports. Those reports are somewhere, just not anywhere I can find them. What I did find was a reference in a 1986 Air Force Intelligence Agency study about Soviet fighter modernization programs. One paragraph mentions that Soviet air defense forces initiated comprehensive radar and avionics upgrades for MiG-25 units starting in 1984. The upgrades included improved radar warning receivers and new tactical data links for better coordination with ground controllers. The study doesn't explain why these upgrades were prioritized, doesn't mention F-15s or changing intercept patterns. Just notes that Soviet investment in MiG-25 modernization increased significantly after 1983. Kowalski retired from the Air Force in 1992. I found one interview he gave to an aviation history website in 2004. He mentions the intelligence assessments he wrote about Soviet intercept behavior. Says he was told the reports were being used for strategic planning purposes, but never saw any results or follow-up analysis. Quote, "We documented a significant change in Soviet tactical behavior that suggested they'd identified a critical capability gap in their intercept doctrine. I assumed that information would drive policy decisions, or at minimum get incorporated into threat assessments. Never heard anything back?" The Soviet pilots who ran from F-15 radar locks in 1982 and 1983 were responding to a real tactical problem. American intelligence documented the response, then filed it somewhere nobody talks about. Soviet Air Defense Command knew their interceptors were obsolete. American intelligence knew the Soviets knew. What happened with that knowledge afterwards is apparently still classified or lost, or nobody cared enough to preserve it. Major Gennady Osipovich is famous for the wrong thing. He's the pilot who shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 on September 1, 1983, after the 747 strayed into Soviet airspace near Sakhalin Island. 269 people died. International incident, major diplomatic crisis. Osipovich became the face of Soviet air defense aggression in Western media coverage. Different guy, different story, different theater entirely from the North Atlantic F-15 encounters. But Osipovich flew MiG-25s. He knew what Soviet interceptor pilots were dealing with during the early 1980s. And in 1991, he gave an interview to a Russian aviation magazine where he talked about his career and the aircraft he flew, and the missions nobody outside Soviet air defense forces understood. The interview was published in Aviatsiya I Kosmonautika in March 1991. I found it in a university library archive. These 12 pages. Most of it covers the Kal 007 incident because that's what people wanted to hear about. But near the end, the interviewer asks Osipovich about MiG-25 capabilities and whether the aircraft was still relevant in modern air combat. Osipovich's response, "The MiG-25 was built to intercept bombers. It did that job well when bombers were the threat." By the early 1980s, the threat had changed. The American fighters that made the MiG-25 obsolete were faster in practical terms, had better radar, and could engage us before we knew they were there. We trained to those conditions, but training doesn't fix fundamental design limitations. The interviewer doesn't follow up, doesn't ask which American fighters, doesn't ask about specific encounters or tactical adjustments. Just moves on to the next question about Osipovich's post-military career. That quote is the closest I've found to a Soviet pilot explicitly acknowledging what Norwegian radar logs and American intelligence assessments documented. The MiG-25 couldn't compete with the F-15. Soviet pilots knew it. They adjusted their tactics accordingly, which meant running away when the odds were bad. Osipovich died in 2001. I don't know if anyone ever asked him to elaborate on what he meant by engage us before we knew they were there, or which specific encounters informed his assessment. The interview suggests he had direct knowledge. He flew MiG-25s operationally during the early 1980s. He would have received the same tactical guidance as pilots in the Northern Fleet units. Maybe he experienced radar locks from unseen fighters. Maybe he just heard about it from other pilots. The records don't say. Viktor Bekrenev, the pilot from Section 2 who got locked at 160 kilometers, retired from the Soviet Air Force in 1987. I found references to him in a 2012 Russian aviation history book. The author interviewed Bekrenev briefly about his service. Bekrenev declined to discuss specific missions. Said operational details from the Cold War period were still sensitive even decades later. He died in 2018. The Soviet pilots who flew MiG-25 intercepts during 1982 and 1983 experienced something their doctrine said shouldn't happen. American fighters tracking them at ranges their own radar couldn't match. Warning receivers screaming fire control lock when nothing was visible on their scopes.